Hello everyone and welcome back to the 18th episode of the Road to FIDE Master series, in which I will cover two rounds, number 2 and 3 from the Irena Warakomska Memorial played this week. Why two of the games? Well, you will see in a second. So without further ado, let's start with the first one. Second round of the tournament, I got paired with the Filip Cukrowski. He's my friend and you may not know it, but same as during the Baltic Pearl Chess Festival, I went to this tournament, to this festival, to this memorial with a bunch of guys, kids to prepare, to look at, to look after and so on. So I was a coach and Filip was also a coach from our team, let's say. Therefore we had quite a lot of work with our young players, young guys, and basically we had no time to prepare against ourselves. We were leaving for the runs at like 2:30 p.m. and at 2:18 p.m. we opened our laptops trying to prepare against ourselves. But as you can tell, it may not be a good idea to have only 10 minutes for preparations. And well, what can you play as a column evaluation if not the London system, right? So I decided to play a, let's say, delayed London system, and after a few more moves, at this point I offered a draw, which Filip accepted. So pretty easy game, let's say, pretty easy draw, pretty short one too, and no analysis needed. Therefore I decided to include two games in this particular video, so let's just go into the next one, right? I got paired once again with white pieces, so I decided that okay, this might be a good idea to include both games in the same video, right? So what's the case? What's the opponent? Opponent is Aleksander Czerwoński, once again international master from Poland, very experienced coach, known for all the country and perhaps even in the world. So I had a lot of respect for this guy, and perhaps it was not the greatest of ideas before the game. Usually you want to have little to no respect to the opponents to be able to beat them, but at this point I felt okay, I am playing an amazing player, amazing coach, so yeah, let's hope for the great game. I decided to opt for e4 this time, and I knew that my opponent might reply with e5 or d6, which was his favorite openings. This time he decided to go for e5, after which I decided to go into the Scotch game, one of my favorite openings, and also I saw that at this point opponent plays bishop b4 check, which is not considered as the main critical line, so I felt like okay, let's jump into it, maybe I can get some advantage out of the opening. So I decided to cover the check with bishop d2, and my opponent had some games in which he played queen e7, but this time he opted for a5. I did not know that during the game because I have not checked this line since my opponent have not played it, but this is considered main line, so perhaps after playing a game with queen to e7, he then checked the lines and now he opted for the main line, which is a5. It does not change my plans too much. I still want to kick this bishop away, inviting my opponent to exchange on d2. After the exchange I take with a queen, I develop my knight, and at this point I have the critical moment, how to continue. I like these structures a lot, mostly due to the fact that more often than not I am allowed to simply long castle, play f3 solidifying the center, and then go for the kill. It works amazingly not only for myself but my students too, in every format basically. But with this respect I felt against my opponent, I felt like maybe going for a kill so early would not be a good idea, also because he's a very experienced international master dealing with such attacks nicely, so I felt like okay, maybe let's go for the, let's say, easier route, which was bishop d3. I decided to simply develop the bishop and overprotect the e4 pawn, and I felt like at this point my opponent might try to play a4. Why? Well, at first from the distance I did not pay enough attention to this move. I felt like okay, I can now play knight c5 and this pawn will be a weakness. So what can he play? Well, maybe my opponent can try to play, let's say, a move like b6 maybe, and after I take the pawn he can try to go for d5. Why? Because this knight is attacked, this knight is protecting it, but at the same time this knight has nowhere to go. So not only my c3 knight is overloaded, but also this knight has to still use at least one more tempo to get out of this a4 trap, let's say. So I thought, okay, after this sequence actually, I might be able to just get out, because maybe I can take and then exchange and then jump back, or maybe do something similar to this. But then I realized, unfortunately after the move bishop d3, that in here my opponent can try queen e7 with the idea that queen is also attacking the e4 pawn and pinning it to the king. So after my knight takes a4, d5, my position is not so stable anymore. I am pressured here 3 times, my king is pinned, this knight is attacked, d4 is threatening. So I was not sure if I am even able to work it out, to not lose this piece at least. Therefore I decided that after move a4, I will calmly jump back to c1. I knew that perhaps I would have to do it after playing bishop d3, so I felt, okay, bishop d3 it is, and at this point I felt, okay, even though I went back, it's not the end of the world, because knight should always have some routes back to the active play. My opponent now decided to play the move b6, and I felt like maybe it's with the bishop a6 idea. So instead of jumping to e2 immediately, I castled, because after bishop a6 I would love to exchange the bishops and place my knight on d3, which would be his ideal square. My opponent though went with bishop b7, trying to hit my pawn in no time, so I decided to overprotect it with rook e1 developing move, and after rook to e8 I felt like, okay, this rook is well placed, this bishop will move nowhere, this knight either, queen has nowhere to go to, so like what can I play? Well, something with this knight. Where can I play it? To e2, right? Thanks to the fact that I was overprotecting this pawn, I can indeed play that move, but after knight e5, opening up one more piece to attack this pawn, I felt like, okay, maybe now I have to once again jump with this knight, getting it back to the action. So where should I jump? I felt like there are two main options, which were f4 and g3, but I didn't like the f4 square due to the fact that after I jump here and my opponent takes the bishop on d3, I cannot take with the knight as I was initially hoping to do, because I have only two defenders of the pawn and opponent has three attackers. And if I have to take with the queen, then I would love to be able to play the move f4, but now I am not. If I want to take a pawn, well, I don't want to take with a pawn ever, because after, let's say, move d5, if there will be exchanges on d5, then my pawn will be just a weakness. So because of those reasons I decided to play knight g3, because knight f4 would be aimed towards not allowing opponent to play d5. Knight g3 is played with the intention of overprotecting once again the e4 pawn. My opponent now pushed d5 as expected. I took, he took, and at this point I had a critical moment, but more of a tactical one, not a strategical one, because I have two options. One is bishop b5, trying to open the pressure to the knight on d5 and to the rook on e8, and still maintaining this pressure, so plenty of pressure to the opponent's position. And the other move would be bishop e4, trying to pin the opponent from this side. Bishop b5 was the one that I've calculated first, because it was more tempting, let's say, but the problem is that after knight to c3 I don't have really a good move, at least I felt like that. Why? Because if I trade queens, my opponent can now just escape from those pressures, because temporarily he has one more piece. And if I take here, well, my pawns are not so great, are they? If I take here, well, my opponent can just simply trade and place my rook on d2. And even though I felt like this dynamic with having knight versus bishop will not be the worst one for me, I didn't want to get to it with this amazing rook on the second rank and this misplayed rook on b5. Like, what's it even doing? So I didn't want that. I can also try to take here on c3, but then queen d5 would be played with the double attack to the bishop and to the checkmate. And after bishop f1 I felt like I have not such an initiative as I had, so I didn't fancy this variation either, and for those reasons I decided to play bishop e4, because I felt like at this point I will be able to maintain my little but stable advantage. How? Very simple. If he takes, I take with the queen. If he takes, I take with a rook, maintaining the pressure to the e file, having a little bit more active pieces, and trying to make this weakness work for me later on. My opponent at this point also had some other possibilities like knight c4, trying to run away from this pressure from the rook and hit my queen, hit my pawn, maybe something like that. Even though I have some tricks like bishop takes h7, king h7, queen d3 that I didn't really see during the game, I was more focused on what's going on in the center. I felt like I will be playing queen d4, hitting the knight, maintaining the pressure to this knight, and after knight c3, queen c3, we would get a very similar position, but with the difference that at this point I would have to take with the knight on e4, because after rook takes, I was not happy with the fact that he can take, queen d5, solidifying this knight, attacking my knight, making this queen active and so on. At this point my opponent played f6, solidifying the knight in the center. I doubled my rooks, he played with his queen, and I pushed f4, kicking away the knight, but not only that, I was trying to then hit the king, because the idea is that the king cannot really go to h8, because then the weakness of the 8th rank will be in play. How? For example, in this variation I can trade all the rooks, take on a4, and after queen e3, king f1, this pawn is protected, this pawn is protected. If my opponent tries to deliver some more checks, he will not be able to deliver anymore, either in this variation or in this variation. And the idea is that because this king is misplaced, he cannot really go for some knight d4 jump, trying to, close the 4th rank or whatever, because I can now simply deliver the checkmate into on the 8th rank, and for those reasons my opponent had to go to f8. Well, what's the case now? The king is misplaced, it's wide open, so I felt like I'm still having the initiative, right? But how should I play it out? What should I do? So I was like, I don't know, brain fogged or something, because I can actually do the same thing that I did in the previous variation with king on h8, which is take on e8 once, twice, take the pawn. Well, in here this variation works for the opponent, but I don't have to take the pawn immediately. I can simply play king to f2 move, then take the pawn, right? That was the idea. And if not this one, then this one. Perhaps what I didn't see is the fact that I felt like this is the waste of tempo that I really needed to get the pawn, but I didn't, because I have two weaknesses to target. I will take this or that one, and I should be, if not winning, then much better already in the end game. But instead of that, I focused on this king on f8. I really wanted to checkmate it. But it's not the good idea if you are playing against such a solid and experienced player to just go for the checkmate in the middle of the board, in the middle of the game, because it rarely works out. And this game, this, let's say, middle game was no difference. So because I did not see this variation that I've just shown you guys, I just opted for h3 move, simple one, trying to maybe hide the king on h2 if possible. My opponent traded one set of the rooks. Also, I've missed the fact that I wanted to basically take back with the queen, and I forget that my rook is hanging. So as you can tell, this was not my best of periods during this particular game. I had to capture back with the rook, and after rook a5, rook gets activated somehow through the 5th rank. Very creative way of activating it. And at this point I was not happy, because as I've said, I would rather have the battery on e-file with the queen here hitting all the squares. So even though I have the rook here now, I decided to play king h2 and rook e3, preparing this queen lift, trying to hit there, and so on. However, what's the problem? My opponent just says, okay, I don't care. He just made his rook look better, and then he did not allow me to take his pawn, and said, okay, I am fine. And I felt like my opponent is constantly one move ahead of me, because I saw this position from the distance. Let's say at this point when I decided to play king h2 with then trying to do this queen lift and so on, and then some checkmate patterns. Maybe my opponent saw it too, and the problem is that at this point I felt like queen h7 might be on the verge of winning the game, because after rook to d2 I can then try to hit the g7 pawn twice. He has to protect it. I can deliver the check here. I can play rook g3, very nice sacrifice in order to get to the g7 pawn eventually. So I would take here, and then maybe take here. And I felt like, okay, this might be promising with the king white in the center, but my king is not so safe either. So do I want to risk it? Maybe not. But you know, the whole line was very tempting, and if you calculate it from this point of view, it's like, okay, you will go for it, right? So I was trying to work it out, trying to go for it, but in the end I didn't. So when I'm telling you guys that my opponent was one move ahead of me, I feel like he saw all that coming too, but he just didn't care. He just knew it will be for nothing, he will not get checkmated, and if that's the case, well, I'm just wasting tempos, right? I decided that at this point I will play c4, and if he goes away with the rook, now I will play queen h7 once again. What's the idea? Well, if we will just repeat the variation, and let's say he has the rook already on d2, so let's say he takes on b2, I can now try to do the very same thing with the idea that in the end, thanks to this pawn being there, I can actually checkmate the opponent because the square is not available for him. So I did not give up on the idea, but it's an objectively wrong idea because, well, at this point, my opponent does not have to accept the rook immediately. He can try to play, let's say, queen e7 move. Why is it an important move? Because it covers the pawns somehow. And if I sacrifice once more, now the king escapes through this route. This queen is protecting this pawn. And well, I might be lost. Computer says it's 0.00, but for me, as a human, during the game, it was not possible to calculate it till the end. And with that in mind, well, what can I tell you guys? If you look at this position, let's say from this point, and now you are looking 6 moves later at this point, you can tell that I was, going after some crazy attack which was not working, and it made my position much worse strategically, because now this is a weakness. This is a very nice battery. This is a very nice rook, and my pieces are not so well coordinated. So hunting this, unhuntable, let's say, checkmate allowed my opponent to get better position. And the problem is that with such low time that I had, I couldn't find a way to just stop thinking about winning like that. I don't know, I couldn't help it, so I decided that if my opponent is just on time in order to protect himself, if I now go queen h7, I might try to switch the move order, right? So instead of going queen h7 and then knight h5, I played knight h5 now. What's the problem? Well, similar to the previous ones, it's a move that is hunting some checkmates, weird one, and after simple knight f5 move, my opponent is placing his knight in a very good spot. He's closing this diagonal, he's hitting my rook, my knight is terrible, and all of a sudden strategically I'm on the verge of losing, really, because of so many weaknesses, lack of the coordination, and so on. So very bad, let's say, idea choice of mine, but sometimes you get so fixated on one that you cannot change it, really, and that was the case for me. At this point I realized that the attack is over, I cannot do anything, so maybe I can just simply, go back, exchange something and hope for a draw. So I did that. I exchanged the rooks, and at this point I felt like, okay, my knight is trapped as of now, but if I try to place it there, my opponent will simply not allow the exchange. He will play there, and I felt like with this knight that can be solidified by either a queen or maybe a pawn, with those weaknesses, it might be very hard practically to play this, even though computer says, okay, it's fine. I was not so fine with the position, so I would play knight g3 if I wouldn't be able to find better alternative, but I felt like I found one. I went down to the 1 minute on the clock and I played move c5. What's the idea? Well, the idea is that if you have such weaknesses, so many of them and so on, sometimes it's a good idea to try to just give up one of them in order to get some initiative or an activity, and I felt like this move allows me to do that. How? If my opponent takes the pawn, which happens in the game, I can then simply deliver a check. If the king goes down or the queens cover the check, I can then perhaps just think about, okay, which pawn I would like to take. I would perhaps take this one, and all of a sudden I got rid of my weakness and opponent got two new ones, right? So that's the idea. And if he plays queen g6, obviously my knight is under the attack, so I had to come up with this idea before I played c5, but I found the variation, which is queen c5, king takes my knight, but now I can deliver the fork, king cannot go up the board because of the very nice checkmate there, but if he goes back, I can take, and take. Somewhere in between, opponent had a better option which we both missed due to the time travel. It was at this point, if opponent played queen d3 first, protecting the knight, protecting the g3 square, and my game is simply lost, but it was not possible perhaps to spot it in a rush of blood and in the time pressure. So my opponent took, I checked, he went back, I took, he took, I took. And at this point I offered a draw. Why? Because it was the end of the forced line. I felt like queen's endgames should be mostly drawish, so like maybe he will take it, right? But he obviously did not accept the draw. He played queen e4, and we still had 3 more moves to play until the time control will arrive on the move number 40. And only after queen e4 and his decline of a draw, I realized that my position is not so great, because this is still a weakness and this is still a weakness. Even though I have 2 against 1 advantage on this side of the board, I cannot really push the pawns to create some passer on this side of the board. So like, what can I do? This pawn is weak, my king is also not so great, so plenty of problems. From the distance, I felt like I can play king g3, but after the check, I cannot go up because of the checkmate. And if I go down, he can then simply deliver another check and take this pawn. So I decided, okay, let's play queen b8. Let's try to have both pawns covered, but after king f5, I'm losing this pawn. If I go here, he gives a check, I go back, he takes my pawn. And after this move, we arrived on the move number 40, so we both had additional 30 minutes to think about the position. But at this point I was psychologically and mentally and physically exhausted and tired and not really able to put up a good fight, mostly because I was so irritated with myself that I allowed this queen endgame to happen without a pawn. I felt like I might have had an option to avoid that, and it was, this thought was stuck in my head. I decided that I would really like to try to trade queens like that if the king is out of the square of the pawn. So I had to move this king as far as to h7 square, and I felt like this will be my best option to try to fight for something in this game, because if my opponent is not allowed to trade the queens, then I can take this one, have 2 passers, and so on, so on. So I decided to give a check, give another one, and at this point to just simply go back with the idea of going here. What I've missed once again, it was the simplest of mistakes I did that day, is the fact that he can just play here and trade the queens and got to the winning pawn endgame. Once again, due to the fact that I have no pawn breakthroughs on this side of the board, because my pawns are blocked by only one of the opponents. So, very terrible loss at the end. I collapsed completely after losing this one pawn, but objectively it was not an easy endgame to continue from this point. If I did not blunder with this move, I am threatened with this check, losing the pawn. And this pawn is a very fast one passer, so yeah, very hard. But guys, if you saw the thumbnail, I believe that you saw this position, and the idea is that at this point I had an amazing drawing idea, and I feel like I would not be able to find it even if I was not already like broken mentally and physically, because the idea is to push b4. Why? Well, en passant can be played, but then actually I have what I wanted, meaning that I have the passer, and it's always a great decoy for the opponent. He might not be able to deal with it so well that he will be also able to win thanks to his passer. Mine is a little bit faster. And if he does not take en passant, then well, he has also a clear idea, right? He can just simply try to deliver a check. If I go down, he can deliver another check and take this pawn. And if I go up, same thing happens, right? But there is one little trick to it, guys. If he accepts the pawn, now thanks to my advanced king's placement, I can actually deliver the perpetual check on the light squares. So starting with queen f5 check, queen d7 check, queen c8, queen f5, I will be simply checking my opponent on all those squares, not allowing him to go away and draw the game. But as you can tell, it's all possible thanks to this amazing king f3, king g4 line, which is crazy enough to think about it and not even include it in the game. So as I've said, even if I was not broken, perhaps I would not be able to see this. So a painful loss, after especially the blunder in the end, one of the many in this game. Not so happy with the result, not so happy with the game itself. I can blame it perhaps on the fact that it was a morning game, one and only during this tournament, because it was the first game of the day of the double round, so maybe morning games don't work for me. Also, I didn't eat any breakfast before it, so it's not like I'm blaming it on not eating breakfast, but I am trying to get my, get to know my body better, my mind better, so perhaps it was not the good idea. In the next tournaments, when the double round is there, I will try to change my, let's say, approach to the morning game. Hopefully it will work out. So guys, let's look at the review quickly. I feel like it will not be the greatest of all. Yeah, 81.7, not great. My opponent also didn't hit the 90 point, let's say, barriers, so as you can tell, not the greatest game of all. But in the end, I was still happy to be able to play against such a great coach. He gave me a very, very nice lesson, as you can tell. So I'm happy to take that. It's always better to lose like that than blundering very early against some other opponent. So yeah, in the end, not so sad about the game. You had to just live with it because, well, there is the second round, right, in the afternoon. And for the next round of the day, or for the fourth round of the tournament, I will invite you tomorrow. Tomorrow there will be analysis of that. So thank you for today's, guys. There were 2 games covered, so a like and subscription would be nice, right? 2 actions for 2 games. And with that, thank you all for watching. We'll see each other tomorrow. Bye bye.